The most painful kind of regret isn't losing someone you loved. It's realizing too late that they were the best thing that ever happened to you. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation Charity Gala shimmered beneath a canopy of crystal chandeliers, their golden light reflecting across polished marble floors and rows of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. The room hummed with the quiet confidence of wealth. Expensive watches flashed beneath tailored suit cuffs. Soft jazz drifted through the air. Laughter floated between clusters of investors, attorneys, philanthropists, and socialites. Claire Bennett felt strangely invisible among them, and for once, she didn't mind. She adjusted the sleeve of her simple navy blue dress and accepted a sparkling water from a passing server. The dress wasn't designer. The heels weren't new. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. After years of trying to impress people who were impossible to satisfy, ordinary had become her favorite luxury. 8 years ago, she would have been terrified to walk into a room like this alone. 8 years ago, she had been Claire Walker, wife of the ambitious Ryan Walker, a man who measured success in promotions, luxury cars, and the envy of strangers. Back then, every event had felt like a performance. Every smile had been rehearsed. Every conversation had been another opportunity to prove they belonged. But that life was gone now. The divorce had taken many things from her. Her confidence, her social circle, her carefully planned future. Yet somehow, in the years that followed, she had found something more valuable: peace. She owned a small independent bookstore on the north side of the city. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't featured in magazines. It didn't attract celebrities. But it was hers. Every shelf, every reading corner, every handwritten staff recommendation carried a piece of her heart. Children came there after school. Elderly couples spent entire afternoons browsing the history section. Local authors held signings beneath warm lamps and exposed brick walls. It was a quiet life. A good life. Unfortunately, Ryan never understood the difference. Claire sensed him before she saw him. Some memories lived so deeply inside the body that they announced themselves before logic could intervene. A familiar voice rose above the crowd. Confident, polished, effortlessly self-assured. Ryan Walker. Her stomach tightened as she turned. He looked exactly as she expected. Expensive tuxedo. Perfect haircut. The practiced smile of a man who spent years convincing the world he was winning. Beside him stood his fiancée, Vanessa Hart, a lifestyle influencer whose social media following seemed almost as important to Ryan as her presence. Vanessa's silver gown sparkled beneath the chandelier light as they moved through the room, collecting greetings and admiration. Ryan noticed Claire almost immediately. Surprise flickered across his face. Then amusement followed. He approached with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted his place in the world. Claire, he said, smiling. I almost didn't recognize you. She offered a polite nod. Ryan. Vanessa glanced between them. Oh, this is Claire, she asked brightly. Ryan chuckled. The one and only. Claire recognized the tone instantly. It was the same tone he used when discussing a failed business idea or a disappointing investment. Friendly on the surface, dismissive underneath. It's been a while, Claire said. Sure has. Ryan looked her over. Still running that little bookstore? Claire smiled gently. I am. Wow. He shook his head. You always did love keeping things simple. Vanessa laughed softly. Ryan continued. Honestly, I admire it. Most people would want more out of life, but you've always been comfortable with ordinary. The words settled between them. Ordinary. Claire had heard versions of it throughout their marriage. Not ambitious enough. Not driven enough. Not impressive enough. For years she had believed him. Tonight, she simply felt tired. I'm happy, she said. Ryan smiled as if she had confirmed exactly what he expected. That's what matters, I guess. Around them, a few guests pretended not to listen. Others listened openly. Claire recognized the subtle curiosity in their expressions. Everyone loved a reunion, especially one involving former spouses. Ryan slipped an arm around Vanessa. Well, enjoy the evening, Claire. He paused. It's nice to see you're doing okay. There was sympathy in his voice now, the kind that felt suspiciously close to superiority. Claire watched him walk away through the crowd. The old version of herself would have spent the rest of the night replaying every word, wondering if he was right, wondering if her life looked small from the outside. Instead, she took a slow sip of sparkling water and looked toward the city lights beyond the glass. Somewhere beneath those lights sat a cozy bookstore filled with stories. Somewhere beneath those lights were people who genuinely cared about her. Somewhere beneath those lights was the life she had built from nothing. And for the first time all evening, she smiled. What Claire didn't notice was the man standing near the ballroom entrance. A tall figure in a black tuxedo had just stepped inside. He wasn't looking at the mayor speaking near the stage. He wasn't looking at the investors gathered by the bar. He wasn't looking at the cameras. His eyes had found only one person in the entire room: Claire Bennett. Claire could not explain why the presence at the entrance unsettled her more than Ryan's words ever had. Perhaps it was because she had spent years learning how to survive disappointment, but she had forgotten how to prepare for curiosity. Across the ballroom, conversations gradually shifted. The subtle movement was almost invisible at first. A few heads turned, then a few more. A board member standing near the stage straightened his posture. A city councilman interrupted his own story mid-sentence. Even the event coordinator suddenly seemed nervous. Whoever had arrived carried a kind of gravity that quietly altered the room. Claire followed several wandering gazes toward the entrance. The man standing there looked familiar, though she could not immediately place him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that somehow appeared understated despite its obvious quality. There was no entourage surrounding him, no dramatic entrance, no attempt to command attention. Yet attention followed him anyway. The room seemed to lean in his direction without realizing it. Claire frowned slightly. Somewhere in her memory, she had seen that face before. Meanwhile, Ryan noticed the reaction immediately. He thrived on social hierarchies the way some people thrived on sunlight. His eyes narrowed as he tried to identify the newcomer. Vanessa followed his gaze. "Who is that?" she asked. Ryan did not answer immediately. Then recognition flashed across his face. "No way." Vanessa blinked. "What?" "That is Ethan Sinclair." The name moved through nearby conversations like a ripple across water. Ethan Sinclair, founder of Sinclair Ventures, billionaire investor, one of the most influential figures in the technology sector, a man who rarely attended public events unless he personally believed in the cause. Claire finally remembered where she had seen him. Magazine covers, interviews, business journals stacked near the front counter of her bookstore. Yet what surprised her most was not his presence. It was his expression. Ethan Sinclair did not seem interested in the room at all. While others rushed to greet him, his attention remained fixed somewhere beyond them. Claire glanced away, assuming he was focused on someone important near the stage. She certainly never imagined he could be looking at her. A group of executives approached Ethan within moments. Hands extended. Smiles appeared. Introductions began. Yet each interaction remained brief. Polite. Efficient. It almost looked as though he was completing obligations while waiting for something else. Claire found herself watching despite her better judgment. Ryan and Vanessa had already moved closer to the growing circle around Ethan. Ryan's smile had become noticeably brighter. Claire recognized that smile. It was the same expression he wore whenever an opportunity appeared. She remembered years of dinners where Ryan had evaluated every guest according to usefulness. Every conversation had been a transaction. Every friendship an investment. The realization no longer hurt. It simply felt distant, like remembering a city she once lived in but no longer recognized. She turned toward the refreshment table, hoping to avoid further encounters. The evening had already become more exhausting than expected. As she reached for another glass of sparkling water, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Claire Bennett. She turned. Standing beside her was Margaret Holloway, one of the foundation's senior trustees. Claire had met her briefly months earlier during a literacy fundraiser. "Margaret," Claire said warmly, "it is good to see you again." Margaret smiled. "I was hoping you would come tonight. The reading program you helped us launch has been incredible." Claire felt a small surge of pride. The kids did all the hard work. Modest as always. Margaret laughed softly. "You never take credit for anything." Before Claire could respond, Margaret's attention shifted over her shoulder. Her smile widened considerably. "Well, now this is unexpected." Claire turned. Ethan Sinclair was walking across the ballroom. Not toward the stage. Not toward the mayor. Not toward the investors clustered near the bar. He was moving directly through the crowd with calm, deliberate steps. Conversation slowed. Some people stepped aside automatically. Others watched openly. Ryan noticed too. Claire could see him straightening his jacket several yards away. Vanessa adjusted her posture. Both clearly assumed Ethan was approaching their group. It would have made sense. Ryan was exactly the kind of ambitious executive who spent years trying to enter circles like Ethan's. Claire looked away, uncomfortable with the attention gathering around the path Ethan was taking. Surely there was someone important standing behind her, someone more deserving of interest. Yet as the distance closed, an unsettling realization began to form. Ethan never glanced left or right. His focus never shifted. It remained steady, intentional, certain, and somehow, impossibly, it remained fixed on Claire Bennett. The noise of the ballroom seemed to soften as Ethan Sinclair continued walking forward. Claire felt her pulse quicken for reasons she could not explain. There were hundreds of people in attendance. Powerful people, influential people, people whose names appeared in newspapers and financial magazines. Yet somehow the billionaire crossed the room as though none of them existed. Margaret Holloway glanced between Claire and Ethan with visible surprise. "Well," she murmured, "this should be interesting." Claire opened her mouth to ask what she meant, but Ethan had already reached them. Up close, he looked less intimidating than he did in photographs. The confidence was still there, but there was something else beneath it. Warmth. Recognition. The kind of recognition reserved for someone who mattered. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan simply looked at her. Not at her dress. Not at her appearance. Not at the life others assumed she had built after divorce. He looked directly at her, as though seeing something familiar and valuable. Something he had been searching for. Claire's confusion deepened. "Mr. Sinclair," she said politely. "It is nice to meet you." A faint smile touched his face. Claire. The way he said her name stopped her cold. Not because it was dramatic. Quite the opposite. He spoke it with an ease that suggested he had said it many times before. Ryan noticed it too. Across the room, Claire saw his smile falter slightly. Vanessa looked equally puzzled. Ethan extended his hand. Claire accepted it automatically. His grip was gentle, familiar. The sensation triggered something buried deep inside her memory, but the connection remained frustratingly out of reach. "It has been a long time," Ethan said quietly. Claire searched his face. The eyes. The voice. Something about both seemed oddly familiar. "I am sorry," she admitted. "Have we met before?" Ethan laughed softly. Not offended. Not surprised. "That is fair." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Claire's expression. Around them, conversations had nearly stopped. People were watching openly now. Ryan had already started moving closer. Curiosity pulled him forward the same way gravity pulls a falling object toward Earth. Ethan released her hand, but remained beside her. "I suppose I should not be shocked you do not remember me." Claire blinked. "Remember you?" Most people only remember the finished version. The smile remained in place, but something thoughtful entered his eyes. Very few remember the beginning. Before Claire could ask another question, several guests approached Ethan, eager for introductions. He acknowledged them politely but briefly. It became obvious that his attention remained elsewhere. Every conversation seemed secondary, every greeting temporary. The room noticed. Ryan noticed most of all. Claire saw him stop only a few feet away, pretending to admire a nearby display while clearly listening. Vanessa stood beside him, equally invested. Ethan seemed entirely aware of their presence, yet he ignored it. Instead, he looked around the ballroom before returning his attention to Claire. "How is the bookstore?" Claire stared. "You know about the bookstore?" "Of course." Her breath caught. Ryan's expression hardened. Ethan continued. "The children's literacy program has expanded twice this year." Claire could barely process what she was hearing. "How do you know that?" "Because I have been following it." The answer only created more questions. Claire had never met Ethan Sinclair. At least she was certain she had not. Yet he knew details about projects she rarely discussed outside her immediate circle. He knew things that required attention, interest, time. The silence stretched between them. Then suddenly a memory surfaced. A rainy afternoon. A small independent bookstore nearly 4 years earlier. A man sitting alone near the back window. Baseball cap pulled low. Coffee untouched. Looking exhausted. Looking lost. Claire remembered bringing him a recommendation after noticing he had spent nearly an hour staring at the same page without turning it. She remembered a conversation about books. About failure. About starting over. About finding purpose after disappointment. The customer had never given his full name. Claire's eyes widened. Ethan saw the recognition arrive. "You were the man in the corner." His smile deepened. I was. The memory became clearer. He had visited several times over a few months. Always alone. Always quiet. They had spoken occasionally between customers. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing important. At least that was what Claire had believed. Ethan nodded toward the city lights beyond the ballroom windows. You probably thought you were simply recommending books. Claire stared at him. Was I not? Ethan's expression softened. Not exactly. Across the room, Ryan's confusion had transformed into something more uncomfortable. For the first time that evening, he looked less certain of his place in the story unfolding before him. And for the first time since arriving at the gala, Claire realized the night was becoming something neither she nor her former husband had expected. Claire felt as though someone had quietly tilted the entire room beneath her feet. The man she remembered had not looked anything like the billionaire standing before her now. For years earlier, he had worn faded jackets, arrived alone, and spent long stretches staring out rain-streaked windows while nursing cups of coffee that often grew cold before he touched them. There had been no reporters, no investors, no headlines attached to his name. Just a tired stranger who seemed grateful whenever someone treated him like an ordinary human being. I do not understand, Claire admitted softly. Ethan's eyes carried the faintest trace of nostalgia. That does not surprise me. You never knew who I was. Claire remembered those afternoons more clearly now. The bookstore had been struggling back then. Rising costs, declining foot traffic, endless uncertainty. Yet somehow the quiet customer in the corner had become one of the easiest parts of her day. He asked thoughtful questions, recommended books in return, occasionally stayed after closing when the weather was particularly bad. They had spoken about literature, failure, resilience, and second chances. Never business. Never wealth. Never success. You never told me your name, Claire said. Ethan smiled. I was not using it much at the time. That answer only deepened the mystery. Nearby guests continued pretending not to listen. None of them were fooling anyone. The entire section of the ballroom had become captivated by the conversation unfolding between the billionaire and the bookstore owner. Ryan was among the most attentive. Claire could practically feel his confusion from across the room. Ethan glanced toward the windows overlooking Chicago's skyline. The lights reflected softly across the glass. Do you remember the winter storm? He asked. Claire frowned. Then another memory surfaced. A January evening. Heavy snow. Most customers had rushed home before sunset. The bookstore had remained open despite the weather. That night the stranger had arrived looking particularly defeated. She remembered because he had spent nearly an hour staring at a biography without turning a single page. The storm that knocked out power downtown. Claire asked. Ethan nodded. That one. She remembered bringing him a flashlight and offering free coffee while they waited for conditions to improve. They had spoken for nearly 2 hours after closing. About fear. About uncertainty. About feeling lost when everything you built seemed to be collapsing. At the time, Claire assumed he was discussing personal challenges. She never imagined the scale of what he meant. Ethan's expression grew thoughtful. That week was one of the worst periods of my life. Claire stared. The statement felt impossible. Newspapers described Ethan Sinclair as a visionary, a man whose investments shaped entire industries. Success seemed woven into every part of his story. Yet the sincerity in his voice left no room for exaggeration. I had lost nearly everything, Ethan continued. 3 companies failed within 18 months. Investors were leaving. Friends were disappearing. Every article written about me predicted I was finished. The admission stunned her. Around them, several listeners exchanged surprised glances. Ethan Sinclair rarely discussed personal setbacks publicly. Claire remembered none of this. She had not followed financial news closely back then. She had been too busy rebuilding her own life after divorce. You never mentioned any of that, she said quietly. No. Ethan laughed softly. You were one of the few people who never asked what I did for a living. Claire blinked. I suppose I did not think it mattered. Exactly. His answer came immediately. Something changed behind his eyes then. A warmth that seemed entirely separate from the polished public figure standing before her. Everyone else wanted to know my net worth, my failures, my future plans. He paused. You wanted to know what books I loved. The silence that followed felt strangely intimate despite the crowded ballroom surrounding them. Claire remembered recommending novels about perseverance, memoirs about ordinary people overcoming extraordinary circumstances, stories about rebuilding after loss. She had done the same for hundreds of customers. It never occurred to her that those conversations mattered. Ethan looked directly at her. You believed I would be fine long before I believed it myself. Claire shook her head slightly. I only recommended books. No. His voice remained gentle. You listened. Across the room, Ryan's expression tightened further. For years, he had measured value through status, influence, and visibility. Yet here stood one of the most powerful men in America, describing a bookstore conversation as though it had altered the course of his life. Claire felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Not because Ethan was a billionaire. That fact seemed strangely irrelevant now. What affected her was realizing that simple acts of kindness she barely remembered had remained with someone for years. Ethan glanced briefly toward the crowd gathering around them. Then he returned his attention to Claire. There is something else you do not know. Claire's pulse quickened. The sincerity in his expression told her this was no casual observation. Whatever he was about to reveal had been waiting a very long time to be spoken aloud. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. Around them, crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the ballroom, but everything beyond Ethan's face seemed to blur into the background. The conversations, the music, the movement of servers carrying silver trays through the crowd. All of it faded beneath the weight of whatever he was about to say. Ethan studied her for a moment, as though deciding how much of the truth to reveal. Then he smiled softly. You probably never realized it, but after every conversation we had, I would leave your bookstore feeling lighter than when I arrived. Claire stared at him. I was just being friendly. That is exactly why it mattered. His answer came without hesitation. Everyone around me was evaluating me. Investors evaluated me. Journalists evaluated me. Competitors evaluated me. Even friends evaluated me. They all wanted to know whether I was still worth their time. His gaze drifted briefly toward the city lights outside. You were the only person who treated me the same when I had everything and when I had almost nothing. Claire did not know what to say. She remembered offering coffee, recommending books, listening when he seemed distracted. None of it had felt extraordinary. Yet Ethan spoke about those moments as though they belonged to a chapter of his life he had never forgotten. Eventually things started turning around, he continued. New opportunities appeared. Investments recovered. One company succeeded. Then another. Suddenly, everyone wanted access again. A faint smile touched his lips. Funny how that works. Several people nearby laughed quietly, recognizing the truth in the observation. Ethan's expression grew more thoughtful. But even as everything changed, I kept thinking about the bookstore. Claire blinked. The bookstore? The place where nobody cared how much money I had. His eyes returned to hers. The place where a woman who had every reason to become bitter somehow chose kindness instead. Claire lowered her gaze for a moment. The compliment landed differently than praise about appearance or achievement. It touched something deeper, something she had spent years rebuilding after her marriage ended. Across the room, Ryan remained frozen in place. Vanessa had stopped pretending to enjoy the gala entirely. Her attention never left Ethan and Claire. Neither did anyone else's. Ethan seemed oblivious to the audience gathering around them. Do you know why I started supporting literacy programs? He asked. Claire shook her head. Because of your bookstore. She looked up sharply. Ethan nodded. You showed me what books can do for people who are trying to find themselves again. Claire felt emotion tightening her throat. For years earlier, she had been struggling simply to keep the lights on. Some months, she barely broke even. She remembered wondering if the bookstore would survive another year. Never once had. She imagined those quiet afternoons could influence someone else's future. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn from time. Carefully unfolded, it revealed a handwritten note. Claire recognized it instantly. Her breath caught. No way. Ethan laughed softly. You remember it. She absolutely did. Years ago, after one particularly difficult conversation, she had tucked a small note inside a book he purchased. It contained a quote she loved, a simple reminder that setbacks were chapters, not endings. She had written dozens of notes like that for customers over the years. Most were probably forgotten before people reached their cars. Yet Ethan had carried this one for 4 years. You kept it? She whispered. Every day. The answer was so immediate that Claire could not speak. Ethan carefully folded the paper again. Whenever things got difficult, I read it. The room had become completely silent now. No one cared about the gala anymore. No one cared about networking opportunities or investment conversations. They cared about the story unfolding in front of them. Ethan glanced briefly at the note before returning it to his pocket. Then he looked at Claire with an expression that held years of unspoken gratitude. "You thought you were helping a customer." His voice softened. "The truth is you helped save someone who was completely lost." Claire felt tears threatening, but she refused to let them fall. Not because she was embarrassed, because she was overwhelmed. For years Ryan had dismissed her life as small, ordinary, limited. Yet standing in front of one of the most influential men in the country, she was hearing something entirely different. She was hearing proof that significance and visibility were not the same thing. Ethan smiled again, but this time there was something deeper behind it. Something that made Claire's heartbeat quicken unexpectedly. "And there is one more thing I never told you," he said quietly. "The real reason I kept coming back to that bookstore had very little to do with the books." Claire's heart stumbled against her ribs. Around them, the ballroom remained suspended in a strange silence, as if hundreds of people were holding the same breath. Ethan's words lingered between them. "The real reason I kept coming back to that bookstore had very little to do with the books." For a moment, Claire could only stare at him. The chandeliers above cast soft reflections across the polished floor, but her attention never left his face. She remembered those afternoons now with startling clarity. The rainy days, the snowstorms, the quiet conversations between customers, the way he always seemed reluctant to leave once closing time arrived. At the time, she had assumed he simply enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere. The bookstore had become a refuge for many people. She never imagined it might have become something more for him. Ethan released a slow breath and smiled faintly, almost embarrassed by what he was about to admit. "I kept finding reasons to come back because of you." Claire felt warmth spread through her chest. Not because the words were dramatic. They were not. They were honest. That made them far more powerful. Ethan glanced down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "You were the first person in a very long time who saw me as a person instead of a headline." The crowd surrounding them seemed to disappear entirely. Claire remembered how isolated she had felt after her divorce. She remembered the loneliness of rebuilding a life from scratch. She remembered learning that kindness often mattered more than accomplishment. Yet she had never realized someone else had been fighting a similar battle only a few feet away. "I never knew," she whispered. "I know." His voice remained gentle. "You were never trying to impress me. That was the point." Several people nearby exchanged glances. The story unfolding before them no longer felt like a casual reunion between acquaintances. It felt personal, genuine. Ryan shifted uneasily several feet away. For years, he had understood relationships through achievement and status. The conversation happening before him operated by entirely different rules. Ethan continued. "Do you remember the old wooden chair near the back window?" Claire laughed softly through her emotions. "The one that squeaked every time someone sat down. That one." A smile appeared on Ethan's face. "I spent hours sitting there pretending to read while gathering enough courage to talk to you." Claire blinked. "You are kidding." "I wish I were." A few people nearby chuckled quietly. Ethan shook his head at himself. "I built companies, negotiated billion-dollar deals, spoke in front of thousands of people. Yet somehow saying hello to you always felt more difficult." Claire could not stop smiling now. The admission felt so unexpected, so human, that it dismantled the intimidating image the world associated with Ethan Sinclair. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire. She saw the man who had sat alone near the bookstore window during winter storms. The man who had searched for hope between pages of novels and conversations with a stranger. Ethan's expression softened. "There was one afternoon that changed everything for me." Claire searched her memory. "Which afternoon?" "The day you told me failure was not proof that someone was broken." Her smile faded into thoughtful recognition. She vaguely remembered the conversation. He had looked especially discouraged that day. She had shared something her grandmother used to tell her. That life was a story. Some chapters were painful. Some were beautiful. But no one could judge the ending while still reading the middle. Ethan nodded as though reliving the moment. "You said people are more than the worst thing that ever happened to them." Claire remembered saying it because she desperately needed to believe it herself after her divorce. Ethan smiled. "I went home and wrote it down." Emotion tightened her throat once again. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Ryan watched from across the room, unable to look away. Vanessa's confident smile had vanished completely. Around them stood politicians, executives, donors, and investors. Yet none of them seemed capable of interrupting what was happening. Ethan finally broke the silence. After my company's recovered, I wanted to come back. Claire's pulse quickened slightly. Why did you not? His smile carried a hint of regret. Because every time I worked up the courage, I convinced myself you were probably happy with someone else. Claire's eyes widened. Ethan laughed softly. I know. It sounds ridiculous. A little, she admitted. The crowd laughed gently with them. The tension that had filled the ballroom earlier had transformed into something warmer. Something hopeful. Ethan's gaze lingered on her. Then a few months ago, I learned you were attending tonight. Claire frowned. How? Margaret Holloway talks more than she realizes. Margaret laughed from nearby and lifted her hands in surrender. Ethan smiled before returning his attention entirely to Claire. When I heard you would be here, I decided I was done waiting. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken again. Not from uncertainty, from anticipation. Because for the first time all evening, she realized Ethan Sinclair had not crossed the ballroom by accident. He had come looking for her. Claire stood perfectly still as Ethan's words settled over her. He had come looking for her. Not for a business opportunity. Not for publicity. Not for networking. For her. The realization felt almost impossible to absorb. For years, her life had moved quietly forward. She opened the bookstore every morning. Recommended novels to strangers. Organized reading programs for children. Paid bills. Built routines. Healed. She never expected that someone had been carrying memories of her all that time. Ethan seemed to recognize the disbelief in her expression. I know this is probably overwhelming, he said gently. Claire laughed softly. Probably. A few people nearby smiled. The tension eased, but only slightly. Her emotions remained tangled. Part of her wanted to ask 100 questions. Another part feared the answers. You never reached out? She asked. Ethan shook his head. Many times I wanted to. His smile carried a trace of self-awareness. I even drove past the bookstore more than once. Claire blinked. You did not. I did. He looked almost embarrassed. Twice, actually. Only twice. Margaret teased from nearby. Ethan laughed. More than twice. The crowd chuckled softly. Claire found herself smiling despite everything. There was something unexpectedly comforting about seeing the billionaire stripped of his public image. This version of Ethan felt real. Human. Vulnerable in a way the world never saw. What stopped you? Claire asked quietly. Ethan considered the question. Fear. The answer surprised everyone. Several people exchanged glances. Fear was not a word commonly associated with Ethan Sinclair. Yet he delivered it without hesitation. I spent years rebuilding my career, he continued. That part made sense to me. Numbers made sense. Business made sense. Risk made sense. His eyes met hers. You did not. Claire felt warmth rise to her cheeks. Ethan smiled faintly. I knew how to negotiate billion-dollar agreements. I had no idea how to walk into a bookstore and tell someone she mattered to me. The honesty in his voice left the room completely silent again. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. Claire noticed him for the first time in several minutes. His confident posture had disappeared. The easy smile he carried earlier was gone. He looked less like the man controlling the evening and more like a spectator watching events unfold beyond his control. Ethan followed her gaze briefly. He noticed Ryan too. Everyone did. Yet Ethan showed no hostility, no competitiveness, no desire to humiliate anyone. His focus remained entirely on Claire. That alone created a contrast impossible to ignore. Ryan had spent years trying to make himself the center of every room. Ethan seemed interested only in one person. Claire. After the divorce, Ethan said carefully, I heard bits and pieces about your life. Claire looked back at him. How? The Literacy Foundation. Community events. Mutual acquaintances. He shrugged slightly. Chicago becomes a surprisingly small city once enough people know your name. Claire understood. Still, she felt exposed. Then you know my life is not very exciting. Ethan's expression changed instantly. That is where you are wrong. The response came with such certainty that it caught her off guard. Claire, do you know what most people spend their entire lives chasing? She shook her head. Ethan glanced around the ballroom. The expensive gowns. The tailored suits. The endless displays of status and achievement. Meaning. His voice remained calm. Most people here have money. Influence. Recognition. Yet they are still searching for meaning. His eyes returned to hers. You built yours. The words landed harder than any compliment she had received in years. Ryan had once viewed her bookstore as evidence that she settled for less. Ethan viewed it as proof that she built something authentic. The difference felt enormous. For a moment, Claire could not speak. She simply looked at him. The man who remembered conversations she had forgotten. The man who carried a note she wrote years ago. The man who saw value in parts of herself she often overlooked. Somewhere in the ballroom, the band began playing again. Soft piano drifted through the air. The evening slowly resumed around them. Yet the atmosphere had changed completely. Claire sensed it. So did everyone else. The assumptions people arrived with were falling apart one by one. Ethan took a small step closer. Not enough to invade her space. Just enough to make his next words feel personal. There is something I promised myself if I ever saw you again. Claire's heartbeat quickened. What is that? Ethan smiled. This time the emotion behind it was impossible to miss. That I would finally tell you the truth about how I felt the day I walked out of your bookstore for the last time. Claire felt the world narrow to the space between them. The music, the conversations, the glittering ballroom beyond Ethan's shoulder all seemed to drift farther away. Only his voice remained. Only the look in his eyes. For years she had imagined what it might feel like to be truly seen. Not admired. Not evaluated. Not compared. Seen. And somehow, standing beneath 1,000 crystals and surrounded by the most influential people in Chicago, she felt more understood than she had in a very long time. Ethan held her gaze. The last day I visited your bookstore, I spent almost 20 minutes sitting in my car afterward. Claire smiled softly. Why? He laughed quietly. Because I realized I did not want to leave. The honesty in the answer settled over the crowd. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Ethan continued. I remember watching you lock the front door. Claire could picture the evening immediately. A cool autumn sunset. Orange light reflecting across the sidewalk. The scent of coffee and old paper lingering in the air. She vaguely remembered waving goodbye to a customer before turning off the lights. She never knew he remained outside. You stood in the window adjusting a display of new arrivals, Ethan said. You looked happy. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Back then happiness had been complicated. She was rebuilding her life. Learning who she was without Ryan. Learning how to trust herself again. There were good days and difficult days. Yet somehow the bookstore always felt like home. That night I realized something, Ethan said. What? Claire asked. Ethan smiled. Success had never impressed me as much as peace. The words landed with unexpected force. Around them stood people who spent their lives chasing larger homes, larger titles, larger fortunes. Yet Ethan spoke as though the greatest achievement he had ever witnessed was contentment. You built a life that was real, he continued. Most people spend decades trying to do that. Claire felt emotion tightening her chest again. For years Ryan had treated her choices like evidence of limited ambition. Ethan viewed them as evidence of courage. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Ryan noticed it too. Claire could feel his attention from across the room. For the first time in years, she did not feel small beneath it. Ethan took another slow breath. I wanted to ask you to dinner that day. Claire blinked. The admission sent a ripple through the crowd. Ethan smiled at her surprised expression. I am serious. Why did you not? She asked. Because I knew almost nothing about your life. His expression softened. And because I could tell you were still healing. Claire looked down for a moment. He was right. For years ago, she had still been carrying pieces of heartbreak she rarely discussed. The divorce had ended long before the pain disappeared. Ethan seemed to understand that without explanation. I did not want to become another person demanding something from you, he said quietly. You had already given enough. Claire felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. Nobody had ever described that chapter of her life so accurately. She had spent years giving, compromising, supporting, enduring, rebuilding. Yet very few people ever acknowledged the cost. Ethan had somehow seen it all. So I left, he continued. I told myself that if our paths were meant to cross again, they would. Margaret Holloway smiled knowingly nearby. Several guests exchanged glances. Even strangers seemed invested in the story now. Ethan laughed softly. Apparently fate decided to make me wait longer than I preferred. The crowd chuckled. Claire smiled too. Yet beneath the humor was something deeper. Something years in the making. Ethan's expression gradually became more serious. His eyes never left hers. Then tonight happened. Claire's heartbeat quickened. Ethan glanced briefly toward Ryan before returning his attention to her. The gesture lasted less than a second, but the meaning was impossible to miss. He had witnessed the conversation earlier. He had heard the subtle insults disguised as concern. He had watched someone reduce Claire's life to something ordinary. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly before relaxing again. I arrived just in time to hear someone describe your life as small. The room grew silent once more. Claire felt a flicker of discomfort. Ethan, however, remained calm, and I realized there was something I could not allow to remain unsaid any longer. His voice stayed steady, warm, certain. The anticipation became almost unbearable. Ryan stood motionless. Vanessa no longer attempted to hide her curiosity. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on Ethan Sinclair. Yet Ethan seemed unaware of any audience beyond Claire. His expression softened completely. Years of hesitation disappeared from his face. Years of waiting. Years of silence. Years of gratitude. Then he smiled at her in a way that made the entire room disappear. "Claire," he said quietly, "there is not a single ordinary thing about you." The words settled over the ballroom with the quiet force of truth. There is not a single ordinary thing about you. Claire felt something shift deep inside her, something she had not realized she was still carrying. For years, she had worked hard to build a life she loved, yet part of her had never fully escaped the old voice that questioned whether it was enough, whether she was enough. Standing beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, she suddenly realized that voice no longer sounded convincing. Ethan's eyes never left hers. There was no performance in them, no attempt to impress anyone, no desire to create a scene. He simply looked relieved, as though he had finally said something he should have said years ago. Around them, the crowd remained unusually quiet. The gala had transformed into something else entirely. It was no longer about donations or networking or status. It had become a story everyone wanted to see unfold. Claire swallowed carefully. "You make me sound much more remarkable than I am." Ethan smiled immediately. "That is because you still do not see yourself the way other people do." She laughed softly. "Other people? The children whose reading program exists because of you." His voice remained calm. "The local authors whose careers started because you gave them a chance. The customers who walk into your bookstore feeling lonely and leave feeling seen." Claire felt warmth spread through her chest. Ethan continued, "You think those things are small because they come naturally to you." The silence that followed felt meaningful rather than uncomfortable. Claire remembered all the years she spent measuring herself against expectations she never truly wanted. Bigger house, bigger title, bigger accomplishments. Yet the moments she treasured most rarely involved any of those things. They involved people, conversations, community. Lives quietly changed. Ethan seemed to understand that better than anyone. Across the room, Ryan stood motionless. Claire noticed him again, and this time something felt different. For years, seeing him triggered anxiety, doubt, old wounds. Tonight, she felt something closer to distance. Not anger, not resentment, just distance. The opinions that once carried so much weight suddenly seemed surprisingly light. Ethan followed her gaze. Ryan quickly looked away. Ethan did not react. He simply turned back toward Claire. "Can I tell you something else?" Claire nodded. "Of course." Ethan smiled faintly. "When I heard about your divorce years ago, I assumed someone else would eventually figure out what I figured out." Claire frowned. "What did you figure out?" His answer came without hesitation. "That losing you was a mistake." The statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Small ripples moved through the crowd. Claire blinked several times. Ethan's expression remained steady, honest, certain. "I do not know the details of your marriage," he continued. "And frankly, I never needed to." His eyes softened. "I only know that anyone willing to walk away from someone with your heart was walking away from something extraordinary." Claire felt emotion rising again, not because she needed validation, because the words arrived from a place of genuine understanding. Ethan was not praising her accomplishments. He was recognizing her character. There was a difference. Nearby, Margaret quietly wiped at the corner of one eye. Several guests exchanged emotional smiles. Even people who had never met Claire seemed moved by the sincerity unfolding before them. Ethan took a slow breath. The strange thing is that success teaches people many lessons. He glanced briefly around the ballroom. But one lesson always arrives too late. Claire tilted her head slightly. "Which lesson?" Ethan's smile carried both wisdom and regret. The most valuable things in life rarely announce themselves as valuable in the beginning. Claire felt her heart tighten. She understood exactly what he meant. Happiness rarely arrived wrapped in luxury. Meaning rarely appeared dramatic. Love rarely introduced itself with fireworks. Sometimes it looked like ordinary afternoons in a bookstore. Sometimes it sounded like conversations during rainstorms. Sometimes it took years to recognize what had been standing in front of you all along. Ethan looked at her for several seconds before speaking again. When he finally did, his voice was softer than before. Softer than the music. Softer than the whispers surrounding them. Yet somehow it carried farther than anything else spoken that evening. "And Claire," he said gently, "there has not been a single year since I left that bookstore when I stopped wondering what might have happened if I had been brave enough to tell you how much you meant to me." Claire felt the words settle into the deepest parts of her heart. There had not been a single year since he left the bookstore when he stopped wondering. The confession was not dramatic. It was not polished. It carried none of the rehearsed charm that often filled rooms like this. That was precisely why it felt so powerful. It was honest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched gently between them, filled with memories that suddenly seemed brighter than they had moments ago. Claire remembered rainy afternoons among crowded bookshelves. Conversations that lasted longer than they should have. The quiet comfort she always felt whenever the mysterious customer appeared near the back window. At the time, she had been too focused on rebuilding her life to recognize what might have been growing beneath those ordinary moments. Ethan's gaze never wavered. Years of hesitation seemed to have disappeared from his expression. The uncertainty that once kept him away had finally given way to clarity. Around them, the ballroom remained captivated. Nobody appeared interested in returning to business discussions or fundraising announcements. Every person in the room sensed they were witnessing something rare. Not wealth, not influence. Something much harder to find. Sincerity. Claire lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. "You spent years wondering?" Ethan smiled softly. "More years than I care to admit." A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Claire found herself smiling too. Yet beneath the smile lived a growing emotion she could not fully name. Gratitude. Surprise. Hope. Perhaps all three. Ethan folded his hands comfortably in front of him. "The strange thing is that I convinced myself you were probably happier without complications." Claire tilted her head. "Complications? Me?" The answer came immediately. More laughter followed, but Ethan remained serious. "My life has never exactly been simple." Claire could not argue with that. Headlines, interviews, public attention, business pressures. Ethan's world operated on a scale few people could imagine. Her world revolved around story time for children, local author events, and helping customers discover new books. On paper, they could not have appeared more different. Yet somehow standing beside him felt remarkably natural. Ethan seemed to sense the thought crossing her mind. "People assume success changes everything," he said. "Sometimes it only changes what everyone else sees." Claire listened carefully. "And what do you see?" For the first time all evening, Ethan looked momentarily vulnerable. The question seemed to matter. "Peace," he answered. His eyes held hers. "I see someone who built a life that reflects who she actually is." The words touched something inside her. During her marriage, she had spent years trying to become what someone else wanted. More ambitious, more impressive, more visible. After the divorce, she slowly discovered the freedom of becoming herself again. Ethan was not admiring an illusion. He was admiring the person she had fought to become. Across the room, Ryan shifted once more. Claire noticed him watching. The difference now was startling. Earlier, his opinion had hovered over the evening like a shadow. Now it felt distant, almost irrelevant. She realized she no longer needed his approval. She no longer needed him to understand her choices. Ethan continued speaking, unaware of the revelation unfolding inside her. "Do you know what I thought when I walked into this ballroom tonight?" Claire shook her head. Ethan smiled. "I thought I would probably make a fool of myself." The crowd laughed warmly. "I am serious," he said. "I spent the entire drive here wondering whether I had waited too long." Claire's heartbeat quickened. Ethan took a slow breath. "Then I saw you." His voice softened. "And I realized some opportunities are worth the risk." The room fell quiet again. Even the music seemed distant. Claire felt emotion rising unexpectedly, not because of grand gestures, because of the simplicity of what he was saying. Ethan had every reason to protect himself, every reason to remain distant. Yet he had crossed an entire ballroom to tell the truth. Finally. Completely. His eyes shone with quiet certainty. Life gives us very few moments when we get to choose courage over regret. Claire felt her breath catch. Ethan smiled gently. Tonight, I decided I was done choosing regret. And for the first time since arriving at the gala, Claire realized that the most important chapter of this story was not hidden somewhere in the past. It was standing directly in front of her, waiting for her answer. Claire stood motionless beneath the chandelier light, her heart beating so loudly she wondered if anyone else could hear it. Waiting for her answer. The words echoed softly through her mind. For years she had imagined what courage looked like. She used to think it looked dramatic, bold, fearless. Now she realized courage often looked much quieter. Sometimes it looked like opening a bookstore after your world fell apart. Sometimes it looked like learning to trust yourself again. And sometimes it looked like standing in front of a man who was offering you honesty when it would have been easier for him to stay silent. Ethan waited patiently. There was no pressure in his expression, no expectation, only sincerity. Claire appreciated that more than he probably knew. Her marriage to Ryan had often felt like a negotiation she never agreed to join. Every decision had been measured against ambition. Every dream weighed against practicality. Every choice evaluated according to whether it helped build the image Ryan wanted the world to see. Ethan was offering something entirely different. He was offering truth. Claire smiled softly. You know, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her chest. You spent all evening telling me how much courage I have. Ethan nodded. Because you do. A small laugh escaped her. Meanwhile, you crossed an entire ballroom and confessed years of feelings in front of half the city. The crowd laughed gently. Ethan shook his head. Trust me, I was terrified. The admission only made Claire smile wider. The billionaire who intimidated boardrooms and investors looked remarkably human standing in front of her now. Not powerful, not influential, just vulnerable, just real. Ryan suddenly stepped forward before he could stop himself. The movement drew attention immediately. Claire turned toward him. So did everyone else. For a moment, Ryan seemed unsure whether he actually wanted to speak. Then his pride pushed him forward. I have to admit, he said carefully, forcing a smile. This is not what I expected tonight. Ethan remained calm. Claire simply waited. Ryan looked between them. Claire always had a way of surprising people. The comment sounded harmless on the surface, but Claire recognized the familiar pattern. Ryan had always disguised criticism as compliments. It was one of the things that had taken her years to understand. Ethan seemed to recognize it too. Yet he did not react. He did not challenge Ryan. He did not try to embarrass him. Instead, he looked at Claire, as though Ryan's opinion carried no particular importance. Somehow that felt more powerful than any argument. Ryan shifted awkwardly beneath the silence. What? He asked with an uneasy laugh. Nobody is going to say anything? Claire surprised herself by answering first. There is nothing to say. Ryan blinked. Claire's voice remained gentle. You are right about one thing. Tonight surprised me too. The room grew quiet again. Ryan studied her face. Perhaps for the first time all evening, he realized something fundamental had changed. The woman standing before him was no longer searching for his approval. She was no longer defending her choices. She was no longer trying to prove anything. Claire felt an unexpected sense of peace settle over her. Not because Ryan looked uncomfortable. Not because Ethan stood beside her. Because she finally understood something she should have known years ago. Her worth had never depended on whether someone else recognized it. Ethan watched her carefully, as though he could see the realization happening in real time. His expression filled with admiration. Ryan looked away first. The crowd noticed. Everyone noticed. Vanessa gently touched his arm, silently encouraging him to move on. For the first time all evening, Ryan seemed to have nothing left to say. Ethan waited until Ryan stepped back before speaking again. His voice remained calm. There is one final thing I would like to tell you. Claire looked at him. The ballroom disappeared once more. The crowd, the music, the lights, none of it mattered. Ethan's eyes held a quiet certainty that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. He smiled. Not the smile from magazine covers or corporate interviews. A genuine smile. The kind reserved for moments that matter. All those years ago, he said softly, I thought I was walking into a bookstore. Claire felt her breath catch. Ethan's gaze never left hers. What I did not realize was that I was walking into the beginning of a story I would never forget. Claire felt her eyes grow warm as Ethan's words settled gently between them. The beginning of a story he would never forget. For years she had believed the most meaningful chapters of her life were already behind her. The marriage, the heartbreak, the rebuilding, the long process of learning how to stand on her own again. Yet standing in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by people who had witnessed every kind of success imaginable, she realized something extraordinary. The moment that mattered most was not happening because of wealth, status, or influence. It was happening because two people had finally chosen honesty. Ethan seemed to sense the emotions moving through her. His expression softened further. "I know I cannot get those years back," he said quietly. "I know I cannot change the fact that I waited too long." Claire listened carefully. Around them, nobody spoke. Even the servers carrying trays through the ballroom appeared reluctant to interrupt. Ethan took a slow breath. "But if there is one thing life has taught me, it is that some opportunities deserve a second chance." The words carried no pressure, no expectation, only hope. Claire smiled softly. "You seem to believe in second chances." Ethan laughed gently. "Coming from a man whose career nearly collapsed before recovering, I would say I have become a strong supporter of them." The crowd laughed warmly. The tension that had once filled the room had transformed into something entirely different. It felt lighter now, brighter. Claire glanced around the ballroom. Faces she barely knew were smiling. People who arrived expecting another glamorous charity event had become invested in something much more personal, something real. Her gaze eventually settled on Ryan. He stood quietly beside Vanessa, watching. For the first time all evening, there was no smug confidence in his expression, no superiority, no subtle judgment, only reflection. Claire felt no triumph looking at him. That surprised her. Years ago, she might have wanted vindication. She might have wanted him to see everything he lost. Tonight, she felt something far more valuable. Freedom. Ryan's opinion no longer had the power to define her. Ethan noticed her glance and followed it briefly. Then he looked back at her. "Can I tell you what impressed me most about you?" Claire smiled. "After everything you have already said tonight, I am almost afraid to ask." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Ethan shook his head. "It was never the bookstore." Claire blinked. "It was not." "No." He smiled. "It was what you did after your life changed." The ballroom grew quiet again. Ethan's voice remained calm and steady. "Most people become harder after disappointment. More guarded. More cynical." His eyes held hers. "You became kinder." Claire felt emotion rise unexpectedly. Ethan continued. "You took your pain and turned it into something that helped other people heal." The words touched a truth she rarely spoke aloud. The bookstore had never just been a business. It had become a refuge because she understood what it felt like to need one. Every recommendation, every conversation, every community event came from a place of empathy she earned through experience. Ethan seemed to understand that completely. "That is rare," he said softly. "And it is beautiful." Claire lowered her gaze for a moment, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. When she looked up again, Ethan was smiling at her with quiet admiration. Not admiration for what she owned. Not admiration for what she achieved. Admiration for who she was. The distinction meant everything. Margaret Holloway suddenly dabbed at her eyes again. Several guests laughed affectionately. Someone near the back murmured that this was better than any speech scheduled for the evening. More laughter followed. The atmosphere had become warm and human in a way charity galas rarely achieved. Ethan finally extended his hand toward Claire. The gesture was simple, respectful, hopeful. "Would you let me take you to dinner sometime?" The room collectively held its breath. Claire looked at his hand, then at his face, then at the years of honesty reflected in his eyes. A slow smile appeared, the kind that begins in the heart before reaching the lips. She placed her hand in his. "I think," she said softly, "you have waited long enough." The applause that followed filled the ballroom, but neither of them seemed to hear it. Because in that moment, surrounded by noise, light, and celebration, all Claire could see was the man who once sat quietly by a bookstore window and never truly stopped believing in her. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling in the ballroom remained. It lingered in the warm light reflecting from crystal chandeliers. It lingered in the smiles exchanged between strangers. It lingered in the quiet understanding that everyone present had just witnessed something far more valuable than success. Claire stood beside Ethan, her hand still resting in his. And for the first time in many years, she felt completely at peace. Not because a billionaire had chosen her, not because an entire room had suddenly recognized her worth, but because she finally understood something she had spent years learning. The people who truly matter do not create your value. They simply recognize the value that was already there. Ethan looked at her as though the rest of the room no longer existed. The applause had ended. The speeches would eventually continue. The gala would return to its schedule. Yet neither of them seemed eager to move. Claire laughed softly. You know, this is probably not how anyone expected tonight to go. Ethan smiled. Including me. Nearby, Margaret Holloway approached with tears still shining in her eyes. I have organized charity events for 23 years, she said. And I can honestly say I have never seen anything quite like this. Several guests nodded in agreement. Others offered. Congratulations. Some spoke to Ethan. Most spoke to Claire. Not because she was standing beside him, but because they finally understood who she was. The bookstore owner. The woman behind literacy programs. The person whose quiet kindness had reached farther than she ever realized. Ryan remained near the edge of the crowd. For a long moment, Claire noticed him simply watching. The bitterness she once feared never appeared. Instead, he seemed thoughtful, older somehow, as though the evening had forced him to see things differently. Eventually his eyes met hers. There was no argument, no confrontation, no dramatic scene, just a small nod. Claire returned it. Then something unexpected happened. The weight she had carried for years disappeared completely. Not because Ryan apologized, not because he explained himself, because she no longer needed either. Closure had arrived without permission from the past. It arrived the moment she stopped measuring herself through someone else's eyes. Ethan gently squeezed her hand. Claire looked back toward him. The city lights shimmered through the ballroom windows behind him, painting silver reflections across the glass. Somewhere beyond those lights sat a small bookstore waiting to open again tomorrow morning. Children would walk through its doors. Customers would browse shelves. Life would continue exactly as it always had. And somehow that thought made her smile. Ethan noticed. What are you thinking about? Claire glanced toward the skyline. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. She nodded. I have a reading event at 10 o'clock. Ethan laughed. Of course you do. 3 elementary schools are participating. That sounds important. Claire smiled. It is. Ethan's expression softened. That is one of my favorite things about you. She raised an eyebrow. Only one. He laughed again. The sound felt easy, familiar, like something that belonged in her future. The evening gradually resumed around them. Music returned. Conversations restarted. Glasses clinked. Yet Claire knew she would remember this night forever. Not because of the luxury, not because of the attention, because of what it revealed. Years earlier, she had walked away from a marriage believing she had failed. Then she spent years rebuilding a life that looked ordinary from the outside. A bookstore, a community, quiet routines, small victories. She never realized she was actually building something extraordinary. A life rooted in purpose, a life rooted in authenticity, a life rooted in kindness. And in the end, that life brought her exactly where she was meant to be. Ethan followed her gaze toward the city one last time. Then he smiled. Funny, isn't it? Claire looked at him. What is? His eyes reflected the lights beyond the windows. The best things in life usually arrive when you stop chasing them. Claire thought about that. Then she smiled. Maybe they were finding their way to us all along. Ethan's smile widened. Neither of them spoke again for several moments. They simply stood together beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers while the city sparkled beyond the glass. A woman who had learned her worth. A man who finally found the courage to tell the truth. And a future neither of them could have imagined years earlier. Ryan never understood what he lost. But Claire finally understood what she found. And that made all the difference. Revenge was never her plan. Peace was. And tonight, she had finally found it.